Hey everybody, in this video we're going to do a full review of Mythic Plus Week 2, getting into the healer meta as well as the difficulty of the various dungeons. Then we're going to get into Week 3, talk about the affixes, and spend a little bit of time on the Thundering affix too, so let's get right into it. So let's start with the healer meta. So this is the sub-creation tier list for this week as of Sunday. I think that the Bursting Grievous affixes have a lot to do with what we're seeing here. Any healing spec that struggles with constant throughput is going to have a really rough time with Bursting Grievous, and I think that's reflected here. Resto Dude is going to live at the top likely for the rest of the season unless there's a major nerf or buff to some other class, so I think we can pretty much pencil them in there every week as it stands now. Resto has the throughput to withstand these affixes easily, and the utility to do well with just about any other affix combo I can think of relative to the other healers. Evoker also has the throughput to hold up on Bursting Grievous, but after a whole week of playing almost exclusively Evoker, I think that certain tyrannical bosses are always going to be an uphill battle for them. Obviously, Grievous puts an extra strain on this as well, but bosses like Kyraka, the Raging Tempest, and Azurblade test the range of Evoker's healing. Like I predicted last week, Paladin is separating itself a bit from the rest of the field, moving a bit up into A tier, where I'm sure their strong healing kit and boatload of utility is serving them well. There's a lot of mechanics where an immunity could come in really handy, especially on these tyrannical weeks. So let's talk about both priest specs together and what I surmise is probably going on here. Disc has historically had a really hard time with Grievous, and while there are a lot of really high-end players playing Disc for Raid right now, I'm assuming that most of these players probably swap to Holy because it's just way better for Grievous and possibly Mythic Plus in general, which would explain why Holy went up into A tier and Disc descended down to C. You guys know I have a soft spot for Holy Priest, and while I hope it can stay up here in A, I'm a little bit skeptical that that's going to be the case long term. We'll take another look next week and see how things shake out and whether this was just an affix specific thing or if this is a long-term trend. Then we've got the case of Shaman and Monk. Again, I'm guessing that particularly for Monk, this is the throughput issue, handling Bursting Grievous, and from talking with some Mistweaver friends, it sounds like the Fist Weaving playstyle is pretty terrible at this affix combination. I'm pretty bummed about Mistweaver overall right now, as there was so much excitement around it during the Dragonflight beta with Fist Weaving becoming viable and fun, but it seems like ever since that 40-40 change was made, it's just completely fallen off. While I don't think Monk is actually 2 tiers below everyone else and 5 tiers below the best healer, what this really reflects is likely a mass migration away from the spec by players, which is also a really bad thing, but also something we see quite often when a spec isn't performing well. Obviously, Shaman needs some help. To put it bluntly, I don't think Shaman has any advantage over any of the other healers. They don't really bring damage, their throughput is mediocre, and most of the utility that used to make them unique has been added to other classes and kind of just left them in this jack of all trades role, but not even really that great at that. I don't see Shaman making any moves until some serious changes come through. So let's take a look at dungeon difficulty. For reference, here's last week's list versus this week's. Thought we might find some interesting things looking at Fortified versus Tyrannical. We saw some big nerfs to a lot of these dungeons last Tuesday, and I think that's going to play a big role in how these dungeons stack up this week. But spoiler alert, probably not as big as what I would have expected. So Shadow Moon is clearly this season's Mechagon Junkyard. It's likely timeable, a couple key levels higher than anything else you do. Unlike almost every other dungeon, there's really no wall here with either trash or bosses, and the timer is extremely lenient. Court of Stars, still in A tier, remains the second dungeon of ease like last week for similar reasons, no real wall. However, unlike Shadow Moon, Court's timer is actually a thing. If you do happen to find a way to mess up a couple times, you can actually brick this key, but Shadow Moon, Court of Stars looking like the 2 most timeable keys of the season thus far. Now we actually start to see some differences. Halls of Valor gets easier, apparently, from last week. We saw a nerf to Fenrir and his wolf buddies, but nothing super game-changing, so I think it's safe to say that groups just had an easier time with HOV on Tyrannical than Fortified. Personally, from the healer perspective, once I'm through Herge's AoE phase and Fenrir, I'm feeling home free in this place. Jade Serpent actually moves up to the B tier on Tyrannical week. So the dot on the last boss took a 20% nerf, but still hurts a lot, and the fight remains pretty challenging from the healer point of view. There were some significant trash nerfs, and that, coupled with the fact that we moved from tyrannical to fortified, made the trash feel pretty tame in here this week. I'm guessing the issue for most groups is still that last boss. Knockhood also stays in C tier despite some big nerfs to a ton of trash and the Raging Tempest boss. I thought that Raging Tempest actually felt a lot more fair this week, and actually found the boss my pugs had the hardest time with was Tira and Maruk. You really want to have something ready when that Gale arrow goes out. Algathar Academy goes from B tier on Fortified week to D on Tyrannical. Even post-nerf, the Overgrown Ancient is still quite a handful, and any of these bosses are capable of wiping your group on Tyrannical, while there isn't really any trash in here that's too scary, especially after the Skitterfly nerf, so this movement in tiers makes sense to me. On to our bottom two, our two most difficult dungeons. It's Azure Vault and Ruby Life Pools. Despite nerfs to Azure Blade and some trash, Vault felt really tough this week. Azure Blade is still quite hard, and the damage going out on Talish is also a lot to keep up with. Umbral Skull too can get quite messy the longer he lives, and overall this place just felt rough on Tyrannical. I'd expect some further nerfs to possibly all three of those bosses here. Ruby Life Pool still holds the spot for hardest dungeon on both weeks. There's a ton of nerfs here too, but all the bosses are still extremely unforgiving. I wouldn't mind a quality of life change on Kokia Blazehoof, maybe make it a little easier to see where that boulder is going, and something about Kyraka still feels overtuned, although it's considerably easier when your group knows to just focus the dragon at every possible opportunity. I'm really curious to see what the trash feels like on a Fortified week in this place post nerfs, as it was an absolute nightmare week one. Speaking of Fortified, next week's affixes are Fortified, Sanguine, Volcanic, Thundering. Although Sanguine can be quite a slog at times, if it's managed correctly, this is probably the best push week we've had in our short 3-week calendar so far. Most of the tough trash from week one took some pretty hard nerfs, and while Volcanic can be a nuisance for some specs, it's not much of a game changer. As an Evoker main, we'll see how annoying it is to have empowered cast disrupted by Volcanic. Did a couple keys on beta with Volcanic, and remember it being mildly annoying, but I don't think it should hurt too bad. Spec into knockbacks and have them at the ready if your spec allows you to do so, and tanks, kite. Don't do dumb stuff like stun mobs in pools or let them free cast and heal to full. I think we'll see some big keys time this week. There are a lot of trash mobs in the current dungeon pool that love to like clump together and cast and channel things, so be prepared for that stuff and be prepared to knock them out of those pools as quickly as possible. To wrap things up, I want to talk a little bit about Thundering. As an affix, I'm not a huge fan of this, as there's really nothing much fun about it. It's forgettable at its best and really stressful at its worst, depending on when it goes out. I wouldn't recommend trying to min-max your Thundering time too hard if you're not doing really high keys, and be proactive in getting Thundering off if an incoming boss mechanic is going to make it really challenging coming up, like Azure Blade's Ad Phase, for example. Also, if you've got a way to cheese Thundering, don't forget to use it. As an Evoker, I'm sure my groups get tired of me rescuing them all the time just to lazily remove my Thundering, but too bad. Druid can Wild Charge, Priest can Life Grip, which is even a little bit more troll, Paladins can Bubble, and if I'm forgetting any other fun and interesting ways to cheese Thundering, make sure you let me know in the comments. You should make sure that you're aware of all your specs options when it comes to dealing with Thundering, and if you don't have many options, make sure you're helping yourself out with a weakaura or something to make it really clear what buff you have and how much time is left on it. I'll link mine in the description below if you need one. Alright, so that wraps up week 2, going into week 3. If you guys think I forgot anything with regards to Sanguine, the healer meta, dungeon difficulty, make sure you let me know in the comment section. Love to hear from you guys. Also, I'm always interested to know, how's Mythic Plus going for you this season? Are you having a hard time? Are you at KSM yet? Are you pushing into 20s? Love to hear from you about that too. Got some really cool ideas from you guys about names for this series, like the Weekly Rewind, which is super cool, Mythic Mondays. If you have any other ideas that you'd like for me to steal, I'm all ears. Make sure you like the video if you've made it this far, subscribe to see more. Check out my stream Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays right here on YouTube, 9 p.m. Pacific. Happy healing, guys, and good luck in week 3.